All right, welcome back. The show is Your World, and now we want to transition a little bit from talking about acupuncture and chiropractic care and focus on a conversation that we have been talking about over the years, and this is as far as malaria is concerned, and the whole conversation about ending malaria, not only here in the country, but across the region and across the globe, really. And what I've read is that 2025 is a make or break year, and our guest today will tell us why that is very, very important for us to figure out. Because there's actually a new target that have been set, and that is to end malaria by 2030. So where are we? How are we doing? Have we made progress? Well, our guest today is Dr. Willie Sakwale, who we all knew a few years back. Today we have recorded, new numbers and new infections, but now he's here on a special capacity, that is special advisor, on a different capacity rather, as a special advisor at African Leaders Malaria Alliance, that is ALMA. It's so good to see you again.
Yeah, very nice to see you,
Many
Winnie.
years.
Yeah, absolutely.
How are you doing?
No, we are doing well. We are still in the business of preventing diseases. Yes, I played my role during COVID.
Yes.
I continue to play another role to try and see that malaria is eliminated.
Absolutely. And we need to eliminate it because we've been talking about malaria for a very long time, right?
Yes, absolutely. Long time.
Yeah.
But it remains a challenge. We all know that malaria is both preventable and treatable. Unfortunately, this is a disease that continues to ravage the African continent in particular. And just about 2 weeks ago, at the African Union, AU Summit, African Union Summit of Heads of State and Government, there was the African Union Malaria Report that clearly shows that we are really not on track to eliminate malaria by 2030, as has been aspired by the heads of state and government in Africa. Right. We got statistics because from 2015, the African heads of state gave that target of 2030 elimination of malaria. All right. And they foresaw a situation whereby by 2020, would have had 40% reduction in the incidence and deaths. All right. And then 75% by this 2025. So by the end of this year, we should have had 3/4 of the cases as of 2015 reduced and the number of deaths. Right. We are not there.
We're not there. How are we doing? What are the numbers then saying in terms of the actual numbers as far as either the infections or people losing their lives to malaria?
Yes. So in globally, there were around 251 million cases recorded. 97% of these were from the African continent. Yes, so a very big proportion was in the African continent. And then globally, the number of deaths were very close to 600,000. Again, the vast majority of this, very close to 580,000, were from the African continent in the year 2023, according to the African Union report. And when we look overall, we've only had a very small impact on the incidence. The incidence has only reduced, if you look at 2015 and now by 4%. Oh, wow. And the deaths have only reduced, but thankfully, by 15%. So we are not particularly on track, but what we need to celebrate that there has been a bit of reduction in the number of cases and deaths.
That's a good thing,
but the rate of deceleration, the rate of decrease is not what we expected. We see a kind of stalling.
And are there like trends or shifts, as far as malaria is concerned, when it comes to like either transmission that maybe is posing such a danger in terms of now we're not seeing the number of new cases reducing as we want them to reduce, or even the number of deaths reducing as how we want them to reduce?
Yes, there are a number of factors that are impacting the war against malaria on the African continent. And one of them is the issue of funding. When we saw the largest decrease in malaria, especially after the year 2002 coming to the year 2015, is because there was adequate funding or increased funding, especially from global, like the Global Fund, and other international donors. So we got nets, we got medicines, We ensured that pregnant women are protected. And so we saw that decrease. Now the funding landscape has now changed. We are not getting adequate resources. Despite an increasing population that is exposed to malaria, now you are getting a suspension of aid coming in. And then globally, you know, the economy across even the donor countries isn't doing very well. So we are having what we describe as a funding gap. In fact, like I think the year 2023, the African continent required something like $8 billion to effectively fight malaria, but they got just $4.3 billion.
Okay. All right. So then with this funding gap, right, what is the danger in it? What dangers does it pose in the fight against eliminating malaria?
It poses a great danger in the sense that the tools that are working, the bed nets that pregnant women are using and children under 5 years of age, the effective medicines, what we call a detection or a testing for malaria to confirm the diagnosis. This is not going to happen. So fewer people are going to get access to that. In addition, there are also other factors, and allow me to go through them. One of them is what we call resistance. Resistance to commonly used anti-malarials, resistance to the insecticides that are used on the bed nets or for spraying on the walls so that the mosquitoes don't get into the indoors. That's another challenge we have. Now, the other challenge we also have is what you call humanitarian crisis. As you know, in countries like Democratic Republic of Congo now, which has a very high burden. Actually, it has maybe the highest burden of malaria on the continent. Now, there's a lot of movement of population. And you see, once populations move, reaching them with treatment and the tools that prevent malaria becomes a challenge. We have a similar situation in Sudan, as you know. So this humanitarian crisis is also a challenge that we are facing. The resistance, as I've said, is another one. But also significantly now, we have the challenge of climate change. We are getting areas that are getting warmer. We are getting flooding. And once you get that climatic condition, which is warm, wet, you increase the breeding sites.
It thrives.
Yes, and in the East African region, we have documented the increase of transmission, even in the highland areas. You know, places which used to be cooler, but because of climate change, the weather now is warmer. Then we have increased rainfall. So that's why in the, especially early 2000, you used to hear of highland malaria in Kenya that used to kill a lot of people because they did not have immunity. But significantly currently, some countries in southern Africa and even Rwanda, which has also a lot of hills and has highland areas, there are upsurges in malaria there. And there's a lot of flooding in the southern part of Africa currently, and expected upsurges of malaria as well. So all these situations, or all these kind of crises, constitute what we now describe as a perfect storm. If nothing is done about all these challenges collectively, then we have a perfect storm that will lead to us losing the gains that we've made to malaria. But more significantly, putting more populations in Africa at the danger of malaria and death.
Now then, what can we do to mitigate? I know climate change, there's a whole lot of conversation surrounding it and, you know, conversations about what communities and you know, local governments, you know, can do to sort of like adapt at this point. But then the funding issue, what is it that then governments and partners, you know, do to at least mitigate, you know, the gap?
Yes, and this is a very topical issue, but let me say for the past almost decade, we had always talked about sustainability of donor funding. And we always used to say we need to start looking at issues that will ensure funding. And the African Leaders Malaria Alliance at around 2018, 2019, came with the idea of countries forming what we call End Malaria Councils and funds. And these were funds or a kind of partnership that targets the private sector. Instead of just depending on donor funding, the vision was to go to the private sector and enlist them to lead into resource mobilization.
Right.
And as you know, private sector has people are not looked into that so much, and especially targeting domestic resources, both financial and in-kind. And I need to emphasize also the in-kind contribution is very key, because occasionally you may find you have bed nets in one corner of the country, but there's an upsurge in another corner.
Yeah.
And all you need is to transport the nets and get them to the right people that are at risk.
All right.
So if, for example, a private sector, somebody who does transportation, maybe they have delivered goods to a part of the country. They have maybe delivered goods to Mombasa, and now they are going empty.
Yeah.
And if they can just put the bed nets to take to that will have a very big impact.
That's true.
And many other malaria interventions that could even just get expired. So like those logistical support, private sector role can become very key.
I see that. And when we look at the strides that we have made, I know there are some countries that have done much, much better, and others need a little bit of help, you know, and support. So in your opinion, what are some of the countries that have done better, and what is it that the countries that I don't want to say lagging behind, because the efforts are there, right, to eliminate malaria. But what is it that they can learn from these countries that are doing so much better in terms of the fight against malaria?
Yeah, let me start by really saying first, you know, Africa is not, it's a very big island. So we need concerted efforts.
Yeah.
It's easier to control malaria in small, isolated areas. But remember, because of global travel and interaction, it starts to become a challenge. But suffice to say, some countries have done well. In the past 5 years, we've seen, I think, 4 or 5 countries eliminating malaria.
Yeah.
For a long time, Mauritius eliminated malaria in the 70s, and it's remained malaria-free. But 2019, we saw Algeria also eliminate malaria. Then we've seen Cabo Verde eliminate malaria.
Right.
And then most recently, Egypt last year eliminated malaria. In fact, they were given an award during the African Heads of State Summit for the efforts. But suffice to say that if you look at those countries, they are either island or they are also in the northern part where, you know, like the weather isn't as conducive as sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay.
It's also important to note that their malaria is slightly different from ours. The predominant malaria species in Northern Africa is what we call vivax, which is not as deadly as the one we have in sub-Saharan Africa, which we call Plasmodium falciparum. This is the one that causes complications like anemia, cerebral malaria, affects pregnancy outcome, and really is the major cause of deaths. But what we should learn, and even documented, is when countries have adequate resources, like Cape Verde and even Zanzibar at one time, they were able to bring the cases of malaria so low. But as the funding dried, then you start seeing a spike in the malaria cases again.
Yeah, so it's like a full circle, you know, sort of like a ripple effect, that when one side is affected, also affects all this other side. Where are we as a country? Because I've not heard you talking about Kenya being among the ones that have eliminated malaria. Yes,
Kenya, we have also reason to celebrate, because from 2010 to 2020, we saw a kind of 50% reduction in the prevalence of malaria. From an average of 11%. That means if you tested people randomly, 11 out of 100 had malaria in 2010. But by 2020, this dropped to 6%. And we saw also massive reduction even in areas with the highest burden. In Kenya, the areas around Lake Victoria and the coastal areas have the highest burden. And we saw a reduction from about 33% to 17%. However, it's also important to note that some regions, malaria continues to still have a very big impact. And when you measure what we call incidence, meaning how many people tested turned positive out of 1,000, some regions like Busia and Siaya have as high as 200 to 300. That is still very high. But I think what we now need to do with the reduced funding, first let me say that we also need to increase government support through budget support to malaria control. And I would advise that we target those areas with the highest burden, because we will not have the luxury to spread all in the interventions.
Yeah.
So targeted areas with high burden, with effective tools, is going to be a key strategy moving forward.
Have you seen, in terms of the shifts and trends when malaria is concerned, especially here in the country? Because like you rightly put, areas around Lake Victoria and the coastal regions have, you know, over the time been known to be most affected or to be, you know, prevalent when it comes to malaria. But are there other regions that have sort of surprised you? Because the different things like climate change, you know, for example, that have brought up a crop of new malaria cases.
Yes. What we call fringe areas, you know, you have highland areas, like, for example, in Nandi, we have seen increased cases of malaria along the border. But the most surprising, actually, is Turkana, which is likely attributable to climate change. It's now becoming quite endemic. And you can see also because of movement of populations from Sudan coming. And then they're confined to particular environment, refugee status. That has contributed to that increase. Actually, Turkana now is endemic of malaria. That was not the case some years back.
Some years back. So then do we have like latest technologies, you know, applied to at least help in the fight to eliminate malaria, either here in the country, across the African region, or, you know, across the globe?
Yeah, there are a number of new innovations that have come. I think I'll want to mention a few. One is to deal with the insecticide resistance. So we now have what you call dual nets. So instead of using only one class of insecticide, which the mosquito is resistant to, you use two, so that the two of them working together then are more effective. But these are now more expensive. And I would say again that technology is not yet on the African continent. We would wish that where the private sector leads the way to bring it here, because as we learned from the COVID response, when there's international crisis, the supply chains are affected, local manufacturing, which is one thing that Malaria councils also focus on, becomes very key in ensuring sustainability of the interventions that we are doing.
And like you said, again, it's a collective effort to ensure that we get there, and especially with the latest technologies. Vaccines. Can we talk about vaccines?
Yes, vaccines. Yeah, for many years we never believed that we would live at a time when there would be a vaccine against malaria. But about 20 to 25 years, there's been a lot, and we got the first vaccine, that is RTSS, that showed a lot of promise. With about 40% efficacy. Now it has been deployed in a number of African countries. It is one of the added tools. We would want to see more effective vaccines, and we are happy that now with the new technologies in the field of vaccines, there is potential of getting even much better vaccines. But even the ones which are there now are helping to save lives.
I see that. When you talk about the different challenges, say funding, for example, and then, you know, climate change here, can we also talk about habits? And we as a people and we as a community, because remember there's a lot of conversation around, yes, the nets are available, but people are not using it for the intended purpose. We use it in our shambas, you know, and all those things. And that brings a bit of a challenge when it comes to then fighting malaria. So where are we in terms of, number one, awareness, but also habits, you know, that we do on a day-to-day basis that might help us to achieve the 2030 target?
Yeah, what we are talking is what we call behavior change communication, social behavior change communication. And for malaria, interestingly, it begins from the fact that people think malaria is just a common illness. You know, when you meet people, they say, malaria too. Even when they are sick, malaria too. Basically saying it's not a big thing. Yet, it is that big, and we must change that. Because, remember, malaria is a leading cause of death in this country. But even when you come to schools, it's a leading cause of school absenteeism. So children miss school because of that. Again, people going to work, loss of productivity, that is there. But now when the tools are there, then we get a challenge of acceptance and use consistently. The behavior of ensuring you go for treatment, the behavior of ensuring that mothers who are pregnant go and visit the antenatal clinic and take the right medicines to prevent transmission of malaria to the unborn baby. All these efforts require a kind of communication campaign within communities. And I'm happy that that has been given a priority. It's a bit costly. We would wish it is done more consistently, but I know support the Ministry of Health, and also the Malaria Council is supporting some of that in the high endemic areas. But it's an area that there would also be a lot of in-kind support. Like, for example, churches can take leadership in this. The faith-based organization can use certain Sundays, like we see in some countries in Southern Africa doing. And of course, the media is also very key in passing these messages. I wish we had a lot of time that we can be really showing how malaria causes deaths. So that people then understand and then can change their behaviors.
Yeah, because again, like you said, it is treatable and it's preventable,
yes.
you know, at the same time. So really, in 2025, we shouldn't be talking about deaths caused by malaria, but here we are, right?
Yeah, yes.
But can we also address, you know, the targets that were set in the catalytic framework, and that is to end AIDS, to end TB, and eliminate malaria in the continent by 2030.
Yeah.
So how are we advancing, you know, towards this?
We, in a very big way, we have stalled. We should now be at 75%.
Okay.
And really, as I've said, in terms of incidents, we've only had 4% reduction. And in terms of deaths, 15%, not 75%. And to me, I think the issue of funding is key. And let me now talk about Kenya. Kenya has what we call the Kenya Malaria Strategy that aligns to those targets. And they recently launched the 5-year strategy that covers 2025 to 2030 and costed it. And it requires 86 billion Kenya shillings for the 5 years. So on average, 17 to 18 billion. But when they projected, only 48% is to be funded over that 5-year period. And that is before the American suspension of support came. So that gap is going to be wider. Yet, this is the strategy that says we must do A, B, C, D, including the social behavior change communication that you talk about. So from where I sit, I think it is very urgent that we really focus on ensuring that we start funding the Kenya Malaria Strategy. We start filling those gaps. And that's really where the End Malaria Council and partners come in. We also have what we call the Global Fund replenishment. Global Fund actually is the main funder of malaria efforts. And as I said, you see, malaria is not just localized in Kenya. So the global partnership with Global Fund, so that 62% of malaria funding actually comes from Global Fund. But countries must put money into that fund. There's an upcoming replenishment in Johannesburg, I think in April. It is going to be very crucial that globally people put money to ensure the gains made and therefore to support Africa to get back on track.
I see that. I say that. And we really hope that, you know, we can get there. By 2030, really would not be talking about, you know, ending malaria and all those things. Because like I said, 2025 is a make or break year in 10 seconds. Why?
Because then we just have 5 years. But we have this thing we call a perfect storm. But we can do something about it. We can't sit back. We can't just whine that now donors are not giving us money. There's something we can do. Countries have done it. We can do it. We must save lives from malaria.
We must. There's no other shot. We must. Thank you so much, Dr. Willis, for coming by today. Dr. Willis Akwale, who's a special advisor at Africa Leaders Malaria Alliance. That is ALMA. And of course, a reminder on the groundbreaking coalition of African Union heads of state and government working with partners to eliminate malaria by 2030. So really, by 2030, we shouldn't be talking about malaria, okay? But that makes it for the show today right here on Your World. Thank you so much for tuning in. But if you have any more questions, again, our socials are at NTV Kenya, both on Facebook and on X and on YouTube as well. So let's keep the conversation going. But from me and the entire team who made this possible, we say thank you, God bless, have yourselves a lovely day ahead, and see you tomorrow on Trendy Thursday.